Green. That was the color of my childhood, especially one day in particular, on my 7th birthday. It was the same as any other day. I had been told to play outside so my aunt and uncle could bicker about who got to watch me for the rest of the day, which usually led to me playing by myself with one of them staring at me. But this particular day, when I went outside, something was strange. It had started out normal enough. I was told to go play outside, and before the screen door could shut on the back porch, Aunt and Uncle would argue. I took my steps off of the wooden porch, that in my opinion could use a little TLC, where I could hear Auntie's and Uncle's words fade with every step. I took my usual path across the soft grassy yard, letting my eyes close and relaxing as every step grew cooler and cooler on my bare feet. There was a point where the grass grew thin, and I could feel dirt right under my toes. That's where I stopped, and knew I was standing right in front of the woods that were behind my house. I slowly opened my eyes and tilted my head slightly in curiosity. I stood there right at the tree line. Somewhere between the house and where I stood, everything had shifted. It had all tinted into the color green, and it seemed as if everything was just a little off. A figure seemed to move further away from me behind the trees. I had seen the shape before, moving in shadows, and every once in a while I could almost hear my name being called. To be quite frank, this figure had eluded me for the very last time, and I was bound and determined to find this person and finally say, hello. As I pursued them, however, I kept tripping on roots and twigs that I wasn't accustomed to. I felt strange stumbling over myself in a place I had known my entire life. When I finally caught up to them, they stood facing me in a small opening, separate from the trees and underbrush. She was familiar in such a pleasant way. Her face lit up at the sight of me stumbling into the clearing, and I could not help but giggle back. The smile slowly faded, and her eyes turned sad, scaring me just a little. Mama? I don't know why, but it felt right to say then. She just looked at me calmly and said, Run. This word hadn't been said before, but I thought it on numerous occasions. Aunt and Uncle left me outside for hours. I could get so far, they would never know where to look first. I took a step forward, unsure of my own legs. The mere thought set my fingers tingling. Run! Her voice caught my thoughts, and with it my feet. I didn't really know this woman, but I felt she loved me more than Aunt and Uncle could ever love me. So I kept running. I ran for what seemed like hours. The entire time my hands stayed tingling. The presence of a storm lay behind, me barely noticing it. The only reason I stopped running was because the trees had cleared and I found myself in the middle of someone's backyard. Everything faded away at that point, and I remember everything blurring into focus. I was in a room. From the blue walls and the various toys sprawled out on the ground, I could tell it was a boy's room. I felt something, and I of course looked over to see what was making me feel so uncomfortable. My head felt fuzzy as I turned to look, and sitting right beside me was a little boy, asleep in a little stuffed chair next to my bed. I looked at him, opening and closing my eyes slowly to try and put everything in focus. He had very neat hair, and he slept funny. His back was straight and his head had fallen behind, making his mouth stay wide open. I had let out a small laugh at the sight. He must have had wonderful hearing, because as soon as I laughed, he slowly opened his eyes, and he lifted his head, closing his mouth simultaneously. He rubbed his eyes and smoothly set them on my own. My heart sank, and for a few seconds I was stunned, staring at the strange boy. Once I had gotten my thoughts back, all I could do was sink into the covers, hiding my bright red face. I felt lightheaded again, but dared not look above the covers quite yet. After a few moments I peeked out, but there was no one there. I wasn't even in the same room. My head spun as I jumped out of the bed, spinning in circles, trying to find the door. When I got my ground, I caught the door handle, flinging it open and bracing myself on the frame. At that point I heard a voice. He must have been talking on the phone because I didn't hear the other end of the conversation. The conversation I heard went something like this. No, I told you. It's a little girl. I know it's impossible, but the fact is she's here. I don't care if there hasn't been a report of a missing person. I'm not making this up. I'm telling you it's the truth. Yes, well, that happened as well. But you guys got here so slow, so you missed them. No, they had black cloaks, not masks, and it was a line of at least 100 men, just walking into the trees in my... I'm not making this up! I knew I had to get out of there, so while the man was distracted, I slowly walked down the hall. He was in another room that opened up parallel to the hallway. I stopped at the opening and peeked my head out. He was pacing, talking on the phone. His footsteps were heavy, and he had an urgency to him that made me antsy to leave. He seemed to be walking in a very repetitive pattern. A wide circle that left his back to the opening just long enough for me to walk past, and him not to notice. I waited 2 circles before I made my move. In all honesty, I could have walked right on through and he wouldn't have noticed me with his back turned. But I was so scared I timidly ran and tried keeping my feet light on the ground as to not to make any noise. I made it past, sliding myself through the front door and gasping for air as soon as the door latched shut behind me. I had made it out of the house. I was terrified like Auntie or Uncle would have caught me at any second. It was still bright outside, but the ground was wet and the air smelt of rain. I tried to get my bearing on which direction I wanted to go. It was so blurry at that point. I knew that this was the house that I had found while running, so the best option was to keep going in the same direction. But I didn't want to go near a town, or be at risk of anyone finding me. I was so scared. My hands started tingling again, and for a moment I felt lighter. I let my eyes shut, and the image of that woman passed through my head, and I knew I had to listen. Run was the only thing I was getting from her. When I opened my eyes, I was doing just that. I was running. I don't even know which way I had chosen, but it felt right. I was in the woods again, passing houses every once in a while. Some were empty and closed up, while others had families in them. Some even playing outside. Every once in a while, someone would approach. If it were a child or an adult, they all seemed to look at me the same way. They all tried to help. The kids would play with me, and the adults would find things for me to do. I don't know how long it was before I stopped running, going to various houses, staying for a day, a week. I don't know. I just knew I couldn't stay long. But the loneliness in my heart started growing, and I felt myself extending my stay. I learned fast not to disobey the voice in the back of my head that told me when it was the right time to leave. For one day I did just that. I disobeyed. I couldn't help myself. I just wanted to stay. And they seemed like they wanted me as well. However, one morning I woke up to talking and muttering of the people that I had chosen to stay with this week, and I was terrified to hear them talking with something that seemed otherworldly. His voice drew you in, and when the voice in my head started screaming, I knew that was a terrible decision on my part to stay. I peeked into the room where they were talking. I had a glimpse of him. His hair was silver, long and straight. He glanced over at me, and his yellow snake eyes became wide, and his smile stretched across his face eerily. He glanced over at me, and his yellow snake eyes became wide, and his smile stretched across his face eerily. I didn't stay for him to walk towards me. I just started running again. The sun was going down now. I still hadn't stopped running. My feet wouldn't let me. I still felt that smile right behind me, and I knew I had to go just a little further. As soon as the thought crossed my mind to stop, something hit me hard. It wasn't anything too big, because I took it down with me.